All right, big man. Today's Thursday. It's October 6th. Welcome to the Dog Walk presented by Barstool Sports. My guest today is the host of the Sitdown. Since it's kind of been Vegas week, I was like, all right, might be a good time to bring Jeff Nadu on, talk some mob, because that's, you can't talk about Vegas without talking about the mob. We were going to do a little Spilatro. We're going to do a little Tony Accardo. I think we might come back and do that, right, Jeff? We're going to do something different today. But, Jeff, first and foremost, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this.
What's up, Eddie? I'm so happy to be here. I love this show. You know that. I've been listening to your show and really everything Boston Chicago does for a while. So, yeah, I know you guys always do some, mob content. I saw you did Bugsy Siegel recently. So, yeah, I thought I'd, offer up my services. Maybe we could do something, and here we are.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I know, and you sit down as well on YouTube, huh? What's the YouTube for that so people can go check it out?
Yeah, you could just search the Sit Down, a crime history podcast. Also have the pod. I've kind of been able to do well with both, so I'm very proud of that. It's always good to have separate spots for people to go view it, get different audiences. So yeah, I was able to build it up. Obviously, Barstool will help as well, and yeah, I love talking about crime. We started doing mob content, and we've really just transformed into everything: drug dealers, serial killers, all sorts of stuff. So it's been fun and it's a passion of mine. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah, interesting stuff, man. And like I said, we were originally going to do that because of the Chicago Vegas tie, but you're like, hey man, let's do Gotti instead. And I was like, hey, I'm not going to turn down Gotti because obviously all the guys are fascinating, but am I right where there's like something a little different, at least new school wise, when it comes to John Gotti?
Well, yeah, because Gotti was really unlike anyone else. He was your first kind of throwback to Al Capone. Obviously you from Chicago, you know about Al Capone. Al Capone was that very public guy, right? He was out there. He had no problem being photographed. And that's the difference between John Gotti and everyone else. Now, that would do Gotti in down the road, the fact that he was so public. He was caught on camera. He was caught on wiretap. But yeah, he was pretty recent. Plus, the way he was able to get into power and how he did things really kind of throws him up into the forays of when you hear the mafia, you think of John Gotti. The truth is, though, like Gotti really wasn't in control that long. And when you look at his actual control of the Gambino crime family, he didn't really do anything transcendent. He wasn't this like legendary gangster by any means, but it was really his kind of pattern to become the boss that made him so different from everyone else. But he was public and people kind of related to him in some weird way.
Yeah, and I think this is what will be interesting, and I'm sure we'll dive into all of it. But for people that are just kind of follow this stuff on the surface, like most people just remember, obviously he had a fucking killer nickname, right? The
Right.
Teflon Don, right? So
Yeah.
he's got that, and then people remember the hit story. What's the restaurants in front of?
Spark Steakhouse. Yeah,
Yes.
and it's funny because I during some of my sit down stuff, I've done an episode on that assassination, and I contacted Sparks and they basically said to me like we don't want to talk about it. They're almost trying to move away from being known as that, but yeah, it's hard because Sparks is a great steakhouse, and if you've ever been there, you know that. But it is again, this is really the most talked about hit in the history of the mafia. I mean, there have been some really famous ones, but the way the mob went about it, the way Gotti choreographed it, it really is a perfect hit. No one was ever brought to justice on the hit. No one ever did time for the hit. People know who did the hit, but there's no evidence. And you have to remember, Eddie, like they did it literally Christmas, a week before Christmas at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And there were people everywhere. It was really an incredible hit. I mean, think of like any city you go to or where you live, and think about the busiest time really in the world. And there's a shooting in the middle of the street. No one ever was brought to justice in the case either. It's
Yeah, I
crazy.
mean, anything in Manhattan is wild because it's always busy. There's just never not people just gallivanting around. So, but we'll get to it. We'll let you start from the top or wherever you had in mind. But before we do, though, Jeff, I do want to talk about this. Kind of goes hand in hand. I got these Italian beef kits here from our sponsor, JP Graziano's. Have you ever had Italian beef? I know you're a Philly guy. You do cheesesteak.
So it's so funny you're bringing this up because I actually just ordered what's the little pepper spread they have on the side?
Giardinera.
Yes, I
Yeah.
ordered it yesterday because I've been watching some of your content and I've heard how good this stuff is, right? You have to get it. So I tiptoed around, I got some of it, and the guy Jim reached out to me and he was like, "Hey, I know you're new to this. Let us know what you think." Yeah, I'm actually really interested in it because I've been watching a lot of food content recently, and I'm
Hmm.
seeing all this different Chicago stuff, and I want to have it. So yes, I actually ordered this yesterday. Weirdly enough.
That's awesome. And that Jardinera is actually in this beef kit. You can go to tasterealchicago.com, and it comes with one bottle of Mezzo Jardinera. It's like a medium blend. It's a little hot, but obviously depends on your taste buds and whatnot. And it's got the Italian beef seasoning. It also comes with instructions on how to make it. You literally just have to run out, get some meat, get some bread, and get some broth, and you'll be good to go. And you'll be eating Italian beef in no time. So it's a great product for people in Philly out there who want to give it a shake, and whoever really is kind of into crime content here that's been crossing over from the sit down this episode. So go check that out.
Listen, anybody that listens to this type of content loves a good fucking beef sandwich, steak sandwich, whatever. That's the perfect thing. I'm excited about this Jardinera. I'm excited for beef. I need to grow my food palate, Eddie. I just do.
Yeah, you'll like it too, dude. You'll if you like a little heat, and even if you don't, if you just kind of like the oil and the blend of the spices, you'll enjoy it. So, go check that out. TasteRealChicago.com. All right, Jeff, where do we start in here with Gotti?
Yeah, so I really just want to kind of talk about Gotti's life at the beginning. Gotti was from a huge family, and several brothers, several sisters. He's from the Bronx, this really, in that those times in the early 40s, still very tough neighborhoods. A lot of these immigrant neighborhoods still just trying to survive. His father, John Gotti's father, was very lazy, and John always kind of resented his father throughout his life. He didn't really work. He didn't really take care of his family. And he's out running the streets. John Gotti didn't really go to school. He spent a short time in school, and he ended up dropping out in high school. The wild thing about John Gotti, Eddie, is if you've ever seen him walk, he always had this like kind of pep in his step, if you will. And that actually comes from when he was a kid. He was attempting to steal a cement mixer, and it fell on his foot, and it would permanently mess up one of his feet. So he'd always walk on the back of his feet, if you've ever seen him, which is kind of crazy because you don't really think about stuff like that. But yeah, he was kind of a hoodlum, ran the streets, started running with this gang, the Fulton Rockaway Boys. And if you look into most gangsters, you guys talked about Bugsy Siegel. All these guys start running with either men in the mafia, people they can look up to, or they just band together with other friends that have the same disillusioned thoughts on life and want to just get through life as a gangster. Because back in those days, he'd look at his own father and say, well, there's nothing for me in that line of work. I want to go be a tough guy. I want to go be a gangster. And where he was growing up at the time, he would actually move to Brooklyn. In East New York, he would live when he was like 12 years old. And that back in the day, East New York was where all the big time gangsters were. And if you've ever seen Goodfellas, like Paul Vario, the Paul Cicero character, he came up in Canarsie, East Brooklyn. There were so many different crews there, whether it was the Gambinos, Lucchese's, all the crews. A lot of them were coming out of East New York. And that's where he would ultimately start running in the streets. That's where he'd meet some of his boyhood friends, and they would all kind of graduate to the mob down the road. So like Gotti was always destined to really be in that life.
Yeah, and the pep in the step. That's so his foot just like healed wrong or something, and he just never had to.
No, he I guess so. What happened was, I guess like the authorities came and he absolutely dropped it and it fell on his foot. And if you ever seen those cement mixers, you hook them to like a back of a truck.
Yeah.
So he was attempting to steal it and sell it on the open market or something. And yeah, it fell, it hit his foot, and for the rest of his life, he would walk on the backs of his feet, which was kind of crazy.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, so Gotti eventually starts running errands for this guy called Carmine Fatico. Fatico was this local kind of capo in Brooklyn, Gambino family guy. And he also starts running around other guys that, as I said, ended up becoming big-time gangsters. He ultimately starts hijacking John Sr. He starts, back in those times in the airports and different places, JFK, it was called Idlewild back then, and we saw it again in Goodfellas. All the families had footholds in JFK. They were stealing anything they get their hands on. And again, a lot of the people that worked at the airport were in debt to the mob. They may have owed loans. They were, betting too much. They were degenerate gamblers. So a lot of these airport workers were selling loads, or in turn, truck drivers were getting in deep, and they were selling their loads. So the mob was making tons of money at JFK. And John Gotti was part of a crew that was hijacking. And eventually he would get jammed up in the 60s, and that's where he'd do his first prison sentence. But he first got started in hijack, and that's what ultimately would lead him to, meeting some of the guys that were in the Goodfellas crew and some of these other crews. So the big thing about becoming what John Gotti becomes, what any mobster becomes, it's all about connection. If you ever know anything about Chicago, I mean, a lot of the guys in Chicago that would follow Capone and some of those guys, they actually started as Capone's driver or Capone's collector or something along those lines. You can't grow in the mob if you're not meeting the right people. And John Gotti was meeting all the right people, Eddie.
Yeah, it was just kind of he did what he would you say right place, right time, or he just kind of he knew how to go about it. He went about it the right way, or it's
No,
just
I think he just truly met the right people. Whether it was he'd ultimately meet this guy Neil Della Croce, who was very powerful, but this guy Carmine Fatico, a lot of the capos he was meeting. When you impress those kind of guys, there might be 10 guys that are in that kind of faction. The one guy that sticks out is going to be the earner, the tough guy. And I've always talked about this. The true gangsters that we remember, the legends, the guys that become bosses, they can do both earn money and beat people up and hurt people. And John Gotti excelled at both of those. I wouldn't say he was the greatest earner of all time, but early on, he definitely knew how to make money. He was a tough guy. He was willing to do things for the family. And ultimately, what would happen is once he got out of prison for the hijacking beef, he got out of prison in the early 70s. He would start hanging around the old club that he was at, the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. By this point, was in Ozone Park, Queens. And what happens is around those times, Eddie, there was these crews in New York. They were not mob crews. They were just groups of thugs that would kidnap mobsters, kids, and family members, hold them for ransom. It was a wild job. Obviously, if they got caught, they're done. But they were kidnapping gangsters' kids. And what would happen is the boss of the family at the time, Carlo Gambino, who's this super powerful guy, one of the most powerful people in the country, his nephew gets kidnapped by one of these kidnap crews. The kidnap crew basically reaches out and says, look, we have your nephew, Manny Gambino. If you want him, you got to send money. If you don't, we're going to kill him. Gambino complies and they send the money, but this group kills his nephew anyway. So Gotti is summoned to Gambino at the time. He hears about Gotti and he says, look, I need you to go along with 2 other guys. Take your guy and you can take one of our people. I need you to go get rid of one of the guys that was involved with this. So they go to Staten Island and they kill this guy that was supposed to be involved with a kidnapping in Staten Island on a bar floor in a club somewhere. The problem, Eddie, though, is this guy they kill actually had nothing to do with the robbery. Now, he was a robber himself, but he didn't have anything to do with this particular kidnapping and robbery of this guy that they ultimately killed. So Gotti ends up getting arrested for this, somehow only gets charged with manslaughter and goes to jail again. But again, he does something for someone very important, and he's remembered when he gets out in the mid-70s. So he only gets 3 years for a murder. Think about that.
dude. I mean, but first, I can't believe that there was a crew of people going around stealing mobsters' kids.
Yeah, they would steal, anybody powerful. They kind of recognize, look, let's grab these people. We'll make a quick buck, make good money because they're charging a lot for ransom. And generally they're just releasing these people. But again, something happens. They kill these guys, this guy, and that's that. But yeah, there were all sorts of people that were trying to benefit off of whether it's a Carlo Gambino or anyone powerful. And when you think about it, it's obviously very dangerous because you're dealing with literally one of the most powerful gangsters in the country. But what was crazy is the guy they killed, James McBratney, he actually didn't even have anything to do with this kidnapping. Now, he was a kidnapper himself, but he didn't actually do this. And with the help, it's funny because the Gambino crime family at the time, Roy Cohen was one of their big time lawyers. And Roy Cohen is a legend in his own right as far as a lawyer. He defended all sorts of people. He actually gets Gotti off on this manslaughter beef. And it was wild because Gotti literally, someone was killed on the floor of a bar with all these witnesses. And Gotti only gets, manslaughter and gets like 3-4 years and goes away. And that's that. And in jail, what he does is he uses his position. He asserts his position to start meeting more people. He becomes a better criminal upstate. And when he comes home in the mid 70s, he, continues to do stuff for Paul Castellano, for Carlo Gambino. There's actually a funny story that I want to tell you quickly about Paul Castellano, who was the underboss. He was Carlo Gambino's cousin. He had a beef with a boyfriend of his daughter. So his daughter was dating this hood called Vito Borelli. He was this like associate of the family. And this Vito Borelli, this young 20-something kid, starts talking stupid. Like he's talking about Paul a lot, saying he looks like people, kind of just clowning him a little bit. Paul eventually finds out, and Paul is so insulted that he goes to some of his people and says, look, I want this kid killed. He's talking negatively about me. That can't be going on. And again, Paul was really sensitive. He didn't want people talking about him. So he has allegedly Gotti and another guy kill this Vito Borelli. And that's actually the one hit that history would tell us that Gotti actually committed. A lot of people actually believe that was the one hit he actually pulled the trigger for. A lot of the hits that Gotti was allegedly involved in, he was just there or may have been involved in setting it up. This is the one murder that we believe that Gotti actually did commit on his own, and that was for this kid that was talking about Castellano subversive. So kind of crazy.
Yeah, that is. Hey, let's take a quick break here because I want to talk to you guys about the Game Time app. It is the exclusive ticketing partner of Barstool Sports. It's created by fans for fans. Game Time is a new ticketing app that makes it easier than ever to score last-minute deals on tickets to sports, concerts, and shows, and they guarantee the lowest price. If you haven't given Game Time a shot yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. You guys are going to love this app. We've had tons of Barstool fans using it. They hit us up on social, and they talk about the great deals they're getting. We've been using Game Time all year. You went to a Cubs Sox game. We went to the Bears 49ers game, Elton John, you name it. And honestly, it's been seamless, and it's been a great partnership for Barstool and Game Time. So make sure you guys get in on the action. It's very easy to use. They have amazing deals, and it is the fastest growing ticketing app in the U.S. You're going to love it. So download the Game Time app, go to the account tab to create a login, and redeem code DOGWALK for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. One more time, download Game Time. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's hop back into the show. And so all right, so 2 prison stints at that time. First one for being involved with the hijacking at the airport. Second one for the murder of the alleged kidnapper who ended up not being the kidnapper. And then he does a job like that for a high-ranking guy.
And like I said, the goal of doing all that stuff is the goal of any young gangster is to become made, right? You become a made member of a family. That's where you really elevate. And that's how that allows you to go up in the family tree of, you have your boss, your underboss, your capo, where you run your own crew, and a soldier, which is a made man. Now, by this point, his old mentor, Carmine Fatico, had went to prison himself, and he was kind of quasi-running the crew that he ran with. So it was only a matter of time. But it's kind of an important part of history, Eddie, in 1976 when he gets out. By that point, the books are open. And what I mean by that is there was an edict in the mafia between the late 50s and mid 70s where they were not making new members. And what that had to do with was Carlo Gambino, who was the boss of all bosses, he was concerned that the people they were bringing in, there had been some rats that were popping up, Joe Valachi, people like that. And the mob was very worried about bringing people in that were going to cooperate. So he kind of says, we're not making any new members for, about a 15-year period. In 1976, the books reopen and you start seeing waves of people coming in. And in 77, Gotti is made in the Gambino crime family, and he's initiated. He gets his finger pricked, and he becomes very quickly the capo of that old crew he was running with, which, again, by this point was the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. And also, this would allow him to report directly to the third in command in the family at the time, Neil Della Croce. And Della Croce was this old school gangster, very rule-driven. He was, when you mention gangster, he's kind of that true guy, had this evil glare. He was just this really dangerous individual. And he kind of would act as Gotti's kind of leash holder in a way. Gotti was very much a lunatic, and Della Croce really reined him in. He was really like a father figure to him. So everything was good for Gotti. He had kids by this point. He was earning money. He was doing what he had to do, and he was a capo. Well, what happened, though, in the early 80s is like personal tragedy would ultimately hit Gotti. And I know people have heard about this, but I kind of want to talk about what really happened. In 1980, John had 5 kids by this point. His youngest son, Frank, was 12 years old. He was just a regular kid, played football, ran the streets with his friends. By this point, they lived in Howard Beach. It was a very nice neighborhood, tree lined, yards, all that sort of thing. So one day, Frank Gotti is at football practice. he's coming home, and a friend of his had a mini bike, a little motorbike, and he's riding it around, and a car hits him and kills him. And the person that was driving the car was this neighbor, John Favara. He was this just normal furniture salesman that lived next door to the Gottis. And it just happened. It was an accident. He couldn't see. The sun was in his eyes, and he kills young Frank Gotti. Now, initially, Gotti looks at it as it's an accident. But from what I understand, Mr. Favara didn't show a lot of he didn't like come to the family and apologize. And I think he was scared in a way. He attempted to move. He actually put his house on the market. He knew who Gotti was. And I think he just kind of got the picture. Eventually, several months later, in mid 1980, Gotti and his wife go to Florida. This Favara goes to work one day in Long Island. He's at this diner, walking to his car, and a group in a van drive up to him, hit him in the back of the head with a 2x4, and throw him into the back of a van. There were about 8 different people involved with this. And the one kind of main guy was Gotti's main hitman. They throw him in the back of a car. We would find out later he'd be shot in the head. He'd be dismembered, thrown in a barrel, and dissolved in acid. And Gotti had an alibi because he was in Florida, but this would be looked into and investigated. And Gotti would talk very openly about the fact that, he killed my kid, and I don't really care what happened to him. Ultimately, his wife made comments that he kind of deserved it, this guy. And, in the end, we would really just know that this John Favara guy was just a very sad accident. Mm-hmm. And John Favara was never seen again.
And I mean, that's the role reversal, right? That's people doing shit for him at this point because he's the capo. So it's just kind of the circle of life, right? In the mob.
And he had plausible deniability. Yep. He's in Florida. I couldn't have did this. Mm-hmm. But he had these lackeys and sycophants that they killed for him. And that's exactly what any great boss or capo has. He has these killers. And, these same killers, people like John Carneglia, who was one of his main killers, him and his brother, Charlie Carneglia, they would be, Gotti's, main hitman. He had this guy, Joe Watts, who wasn't Italian, but he was just, just the same. He made money, and he would act as an enforcer as well. And what this would lead up to is Gotti's, kind of deciding that, ultimately I need to take over this family. Because by this point, Carlo Gambino had died. He made Paul Castellano, his cousin, the boss. And that gave a lot of people in the family kind of an eyebrow raise, because they said, well, wait, Neil Della Croce, who's Gotti's guy, is much more qualified for this position. And Castellano, a lot of people didn't think he deserved it. He only really got the position because he was Gambino's cousin and all that sort of thing. Plus, Castellano had this dumb edict that he wouldn't allow his people to sell drugs, which in the mob, that was big money. Heroin was huge business back in the 80s. And we would also find out later that Castellano was secretly taking profits of drug deals from other groups and other people kind of under the hand. So he was becoming hypocritical. And by this point, Gotti's crew, a lot of his old childhood friends, were also selling drugs on the sly. And one of the guys that was selling drugs, this guy, Quack Ruggiero, he was Gotti's really best friend from childhood. He talked a lot. And he believed that in his home, if he talked on his little daughter's pink phone in her room, this is a true story, he wouldn't be caught. So he would do all these drug deals on this little pink phone in his daughter's bedroom. Eventually, the government starts bugging his home. They find out that he's this big drug trafficker, and Castellano finds out. And this is bad news for the Gotti crew, because Gotti's in control of these people, and they're all selling drugs. They would eventually get arrested. And this was bad because this was all on tape. This was going to implicate a lot of people. And Castellano pretty much decides, like, I got to kill Gotti. I got to kill these people. They went against my rule. I got to kill them. And this is what would set up the assassination on Paul Castellano in 85. Gotti would actually wait until Della Croce died, his mentor, because the mentor was a stickler for the rules. And he said, look, you can't do it, John. You can't kill this guy. We survive by our rules. And Gotti was just waiting. He knew Neil was sick and was going to die. Neil dies in December of 85. Gotti gets kind of submersively gets all these other people to kind of come in on everything with him, the other members of the family. They all kind of come together and say, all right, we're going to do this. We're going to set this up. We're going to put 8 people on this hit. There were 4 shooters. Two killed Castellano, two killed Bellotti. As they pulled up, there's four shooters, and then there were four backup shooters. And when I say backup shooter, they were stationed down the street on the corner, and they kind of controlled the flow of traffic, making sure that no one jumped in on anything. If a gun malfunctioned, they were there to finish the job. This was this elaborate hit, really. And that would happen in December of 1985. And it was all set up really because Gotti knew that he would probably be targeted because of some of his people's own misgivings. And he just killed Castellano before Castellano killed him.
And that was a Sparks Steakhouse one, correct?
That's correct. 1985, really the end of that year. And Gotti would then take over. And Gotti, this is where we begin to see the Dapper Don, right? This guy that wore these $2,000 suits and, was always under indictment. That was the problem with John Gotti. He was always under indictment. And a lot of that had to do with his own just constant talking. I mean, he was always caught on tape. He would have this stupid edict, Eddie, where when you're a gangster, you need to be secret, right? He would tell all of his people, you need to come into Manhattan to the Ravenite Social Club and see me every week. Now, he knew the FBI was watching this place, and there are mounds and mounds on YouTube of video of these guys walking into this club, being photographed, being videoed, and all this was very detrimental to being a gangster. And these other families, like the Genovese family, the Lucchese family, all these different families are looking at the Gambinos and saying, well, wait a second. Not only did he kill a boss without commission approval, because when you kill a boss, you need to get the other families in line here. Gotti completely went against all that and said, fuck that. I'm killing him on my own. I don't care what any of you guys think. I'm killing him on my own. And that was a big problem for him as well, because now he had to start worrying not only about the government coming after him, but the other families wanted Gotti dead. I mean, Chin Gigante, Anthony Casso, who by this point was very much in control of the Lucchese crime family. All these families wanted Gotti dead. And what he starts doing is, getting all of his guys in line, making all of his guys certain, underboss. And this is where he would meet Sammy Gravano. Sammy Gravano, actually, John didn't know as a child or as a kid or as a teenager, as a young man. He would only meet Gravano late in his life. Gravano was a gangster for years. A lot of people don't know. He was actually in another family. He had a beef with someone in the family, and they put him in the Gambino family. He becomes this big construction tycoon, making all this money. He becomes very close with Gotti, and he was actually originally involved with the Castellano hit as well. A lot of people don't know that Gravano was the real architect of that hit. He put everything kind of in motion, and he was very indebted to Gotti. And Gotti started making tons of money. He was the king of the volcano, as they call it. But again, other families wanted him dead by this point because of his breaking the rules, Eddie.
And then that's kind of, I mean, I guess he, in a way, was he in a position where he kind of had to do it, though, because he was going to be killed? Or was that how it was?
Yeah, and I think that's just how the mob works, right? I mean, it's very much like the military. Like when you're told to do something, when there are rules, you follow them. And if you don't follow them, you're going to be killed. So, yeah, I think in his mind, like if I'm looking at it, I'm saying, well, yeah, I mean, they're all gangsters and Gotti just beat Castellano to the punch. But, this, again, was an old-fashioned society. This was something that goes back hundreds of years, and these are rules that you don't break. And, the other families, they want this to be very secret. This was a very public event, man. This put everything on the forefront. Guys like Chin Gigante, like the boss of the Genovese family, that's a show you should do as well. I mean, Chin Gigante was the polar opposite of Gotti. Chin Gigante, Eddie, would literally pretend to be mentally incapacitated on the street to make it look like he could not be a gangster in any way. Like he would for years have this ruse where he had the government believe he was this blathering idiot that walked around the streets in a bathrobe, but in turn, behind closed walls, he was this very powerful individual. That's what the mob wanted. They didn't want anyone to know who they were. And Gotti was very public with his behavior. And that was another thing that added to the visceral hate that they had. Like I said, though, Gotti would have to also face his own behavior. I mean, he faced indictment 3 different times by the federal government. The government couldn't bring him on anything. And that's what would create the Teflon Don nickname. He would face multiple racketeering trials, multiple different RICO cases, and he would beat them. And a lot of people were wondering, how's he continuing to beat the raps? We would find out that one case, he actually paid a juror $60,000 to rig the case, which was huge. And he would always kind of beat everything. He beat the rap. That's where they came up with that whole, Teflon Don thing. And then he had this case where he assaulted this truck driver. And eventually the truck driver found out who he was, decided, well, I don't want to be involved with that. And what's so crazy with this, Eddie, is other families are actively trying to kill Gotti. In 1986, one of Gotti's higher ups, Frank DeCicco, was at a social club, walks out, and a lot of people believe that day, including the Lucchese family, they believe that Gotti would be with DeCicco that day, or would be involved in some way. He walks out, turns his car key on, the car blows up, and DeCicco was killed right on the street. And we would find out years later that the bomb was meant for Gotti. So the other families are actively killing members of his organization to try to get to him. But it really didn't faze Gotti. He continued to just be out there, be very open. I mean, he was at clubs all the time. By this point, we would also find out that he was fathering children out of wedlock with models and other people. He was just this playboy, man. That's exactly who he was. And through all this time, he's making tons of money. He's controlling unions. He's having people killed. He's just doing what he does, and he's the king of volcano, as they call him.
So he's just a super showy guy. He just wanted people to know he was the guy, which is like
Absolutely.
completely contradictory to how it was and how really it should be, right?
Yeah, and he was just really kind of, one thing about the government that you cannot do, and you can go back in history with this. You also not only can't show the mob up, you can't continue to thumb your nose in the government's face. The FBI, the U.S. attorneys. I actually spoke, Eddie, to the guy that brought Gotti down, the assistant U.S. attorney, John Gleason, and he talked to me openly about how, Gotti was just this. He was a complete narcissist, and he was constantly wanted to be the center of attention. He was thumbing his nose. He would beat the rap on a case, and he'd throw these elaborate fireworks displays in his neighborhood, and he kind of became this Robin Hood, and that really bothered the government. He was this folk hero, and not only did that bother other families, but that bothered the FBI, and eventually, what they would do is they found a way to. As I said, he had this club, the Ravenite Social Club. This social club went back years. And at this social club, they would have business, they would play cards, have meals, things of that nature. Just a kind of a spot for gangsters to hang out. And Gotti would summon people to go see him there in Manhattan on Mulberry Street. And the government found out through surveilling it that there were apartments above the club that regular people lived in. But a lot of the people that lived in them were related to mobsters and things of that nature. So they find that this old woman lives in one of the higher up apartments, and they see her, all the time, constantly leaving her apartment. And they think to themselves, like, this is an old woman. Why is she constantly leaving her apartment? They find out that this woman, Mrs. Sorelli was her name. Her husband at one point was involved with the mafia. He was a made man in the family, and she leaves one day. The FBI goes in, they put a bug in the home, in the apartment. And they find out that that's where Gotti's doing all his business. He goes up to this apartment, and he sits there and just conducts murders and talks subversive about other people. And that's another thing Gotti did very openly. He was a real scumbag. He was a bad friend. He would talk very openly about other people, and he would never talk to their face. He would call people imbeciles and morons, and we got to kill this guy and all this sort of thing. And the government got treasure troves of information. And I remember when I talked to that guy, John Gleason, the prosecutor, he talked about the day that he found out about it. And he just saw, in a way, like slot machines going off in his head, because he knew that this was one of the big ways they were going to get Gotti. And what they also moved to do eventually is, one of the big ways Gotti was beating the raps a lot of the time was paying jurors off. But he had this attorney, Bruce Cutler, who was incredibly effective. He was this like bulldog lawyer, just very tough guy. And what they were able to do also is pull him out of being his lawyer, because his being a lawyer was discussed on tape. They were talking openly about him in cases, and that kind of pulled him off the case. You can't have him represent you if you're talking about him on wiretaps and things of that nature. So the government really started to zero in on ways that they could get Gotti. And by this point, Gotti is killing people that are very close to him. He's having Gravano kill people. And eventually that would lead up to Gotti, Gravano, and this guy, Frank Locascio, who was one of Gotti's higher ups. They all get arrested in the late 80s, 1989. And Gotti, his typical arrogant self, thought, well, that's fine. I'll beat it again. I'll get somebody to be paid off. That'll be that. But little does Gotti know that the government has something in their back pocket. They go to Sammy Gravano's wife. They basically say, look, we have the goods here. This is it. We're not going to lose this time. We know we can't lose. No one's going to be tampered with this time. And they basically get Gravano to flip. And Gravano completely confesses to the murders he was involved with, everything he did. And in exchange, he went against Gotti. Now, Gravano would say years later that he did it because if you listen to the tapes that Gotti was making on wiretap, he was talking very openly about Gravano and that he basically threw him under the bus and was going to make him take the full rap for everything. We would find out. Look, if you know anything about Gravano, he was an awful human being as well and should have went to jail. I mean, he was implicated in multiple murders, but that was the real thing that did Gotti in, Gravano, and the wiretaps. The government had a 1-2 punch there.
So what was the deal that Gravano took?
Gravano basically took a deal where he would get less than 20. The government knew that he had to do time for his crimes. They gave him a prison sentence, and it was very limited. Again, I think he ended up doing 5 years for everything he did. And in exchange, he would, for years, sit on the witness stand and cooperate. And he did not only cooperate against Gotti, Eddie. He would cooperate against many people. You know, Gravano knew so many people. He was a very powerful person himself. He knew other families. He would testify on other cases as well. And Gravano would ultimately get a very short prison sentence. Gotti, after the deliberation in 1992, convicted on all counts. He got life in prison. And they would send Gotti off to Marion, which at the time was the most secure prison in America. And Gotti would do his time. And by this point, Gotti actually, you know, he talked very openly about, there's a funny thing that Gotti did when he was convicted on all counts. This is a very true story. The government hit him with a $50 fee, like a processing fee. And he very openly says, wow, you know, government really knows how to stick it to a guy, don't they? So they give him life, and then they hit him with the $50 fine, and he talked about that, and he joked about it. Like Gotti, you can say what you want about Gotti. He was about as gangster as they come. When you're in that life, he knew that there were two ways out, and he said this on wiretaps and stuff. You know, there's two ways out. You go to jail or you die. And Gotti was the truest form of gangster. It's that simple. Was he a violent lunatic? Absolutely. Did he have innocent people killed? Absolutely. But the one thing about him was he never wavered from who he was. And they sent him off. And it's funny because he would keep talking after the fact. You could watch wiretaps of him in prison as he withered away with cancer. You know, he's talking about, we still need to kill Gravano. We need to pay a debt that hasn't been paid. And they would actually openly try to kill Gravano. Gravano was in Arizona at this point, and Gotti would send his brother, Peter Gotti. Peter was involved very high up at this point, and he instructed Peter that basically we need to kill that prick, basically on wiretap. And they would send hit teams. They could never kill Gravano, though. And then ultimately Gotti's son, Junior Gotti, would take over the family. And he was a real blithering idiot, quite frankly. Gotti knew that he wasn't really cut out for that life. And if you listen to John Jr. now, he's talked openly on 60 Minutes about what he did. He kind of said that, you know, he just did it because his dad did it. He loved his father and he wanted to be like his father. And you know, he had some of his own problems. And he would ultimately have some real issues later in his career. But yeah, I mean, you could say this about John Sr., Eddie. He was a gangster till the end.
Damn it, Sammy the Bull's still alive, huh?
Yes, he is. He has a YouTube channel, which is crazy, I guess. A lot of people are blown away by that. And he tells his stories, and he's very open about his life and career, and you can learn so much. But yeah, he's still alive. He's very old at this point. A lot of these people, you know, that are involved in this life, you know, all Gotti's brothers, most of them are still alive. Gene Gotti's alive, his other two brothers. His son is still alive, obviously. His son is actually, which I'm going to say something a lot of people don't ever talk about, Eddie, but John Jr. is a rat. He's an informant. In the 2000s, he actually sat down with the government and gave them a lot of crimes, which would really go against everything his father stood for. But they're actually, you can find them online. The FBI put out, a 302, which is a document where they basically write a diary out of everything that you did as a criminal. And he told them about all sorts of different crimes. And there's actually a crazy story about Gotti Sr. When he was in jail, Eddie, in 1996. Gotti made racial remarks very openly in prison. And there was this black inmate that, took offense to his disgusting slurs and socked him, basically snuck him and beat him up. And there's a photo you can find of Gotti with this large cut on his head. And he was basically beat up. And Gotti actually in prison went to the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a prison organization. And he paid for protection. He had the Aryan Brotherhood protect him. And, Gotti was really still involved with all sorts of wild things, even after he was in prison. And, a lot of his family's still around. His daughters have done television and, they very much make money off of their father, and they're still a very active group as far as on the internet and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean that Growing Up Gotti TV show that was a big deal back in the day.
Well, there's a wiretap, Eddie, in the mid 2000s. Other families, Genovese family and a Bonanno member, they're caught on wiretap in a restaurant in Ozone Park, and they're openly talking about the show. They're mentioning that it's such an embarrassment. Gotti Sr. would be so embarrassed. How can they act that way? They're a disgrace. All this stuff, and it was funny because by that point the Gotti name had just become this just name. That's all it was, and the family still to this day makes a lot of money off their father's name. And the mob definitely did not like that show at all. Yeah. They were very against it.
Sammy the Bull has 500,000 YouTube subscribers.
Yes, he does.
Damn, yeah, he's a big channel.
Popular. Very popular. People love him. I mean, and that's the thing, Eddie, now on YouTube. There are, I have my channel and I do my thing, but there are it's not just Gravano. I mean, there are tons. I talk very openly with 4 or 5 different individuals that, knew Gotti, and they were very involved with him. They became informants, and now the mob is to a point where it just doesn't kill people anymore. Those people are safe. Those people are allowed to do what they do, and the mob is much different than it is. One thing about Gotti that he didn't get is he died in prison in the 2000s, and he didn't get a Catholic mass. They would not bury him, and he had a huge funeral in Queens, and it was very well received and well respected. And and then we see present day. So they're all on YouTube though. A lot of those guys.
That's one of the hardest things for me. I had this content idea planned out in 2019 with Frank Collada.
One of my I always found him. I loved Collada. I thought he was terrific. Very contrite, very honest, super interesting as well.
Yeah, I wanted to do this like tour series where we kind of go around Chicago and we see old spots and whatnot. He was based in Vegas, so we were probably going to do something over like Google Maps or whatever. And unfortunately, he died in 2020 because of COVID. But that would have been an interesting series, I think. Just to see the old spots.
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually had a similar idea to do it in Philadelphia, New York. I guess for me, the thing is now, the mob is still around. I mean, they're still moving around. And I guess for me, like, I also don't want to like go to places where they are. And I don't want to kind of, there's certain places there's no mob anymore, but I also don't want to upset the apple cart either. I'm not going to go and like put cameras in these people's faces, but Collada was,
to me, it was more like the old spots,
haunts, sure.
Yeah. But what were you going to say? Sorry.
Yeah, it's just there are so many, going to Sparks. I mean, I've we had an idea at one point when I was at Barstool previously. We were gonna have a sit down there. I think you remember that. We were gonna do like this sit down at Sparks. Me, Dave, all these different people, and it would have been perfect. But yeah, these places live on. These are the Ravenite Social Club, the place that Gotti held court for years. I mean, it's a store now. It's a shoe store. The government would seize the building and they would sell it. And yeah, there are all these different, one of my dreams is to buy that building and turn it into this like restaurant, like an old restaurant where you could see pictures and mob stuff. And
Yeah.
it's a fascinating world. But yeah, Gotti is a really interesting person. And he did it his way for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was going to kind of leave us off with here too. Was so you do believe that they are around in some form or another. It's just not what it was.
The mob's definitely around. All five families are all have leadership. The mob is actually, in the scheme of the mob now, it's pretty. I mean, they do things. They're a powerful group. Are they what they were before? Absolutely not. They have no standing in the criminal organizations. They're not like they used to be. And the mob at one point really ran this country in certain ways that they don't have that sort of ability anymore. And a lot of the things they made money on, whether it was unions or bookmaking or loan sharking or extortion, you just can't do anymore. I mean, you're not walking into a store and extorting it. It's just not happening anymore. You're not controlling unions. They still have a few, but they're not. And you'll see the mob, like the Genovese family has recently been hit hard with the mob's really cracking down on bookmaking rings. These state governments want you to bet with legally. They don't want you betting illegally. So, they're starting to knock in with the Genovese family, people like that. But yeah, the mob's still around. Is it powerful? No. Do they have clout? No. They don't kill people anymore. But are they powerful? No, absolutely not.
Interesting. Well, Jeff, thank you. That was very knowledgeable to hear about Gotti and the way you see it, the way it kind of went down. So thank you.
I appreciate you for having me, Eddie. Thank you.
Awesome. That's it, everybody. Thank you for listening. That's it for this week. We'll be back on Monday. We will see you then.